Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second media mentoring program for this year. This is going to be a hot topic, I'm sure. I'm Lynn Barrett, president of the board of Vermont Independent Media. And tonight's discussion will be about social media, the age of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And you're going to hear what all those things mean shortly. And why media literacy is so important to intelligent civic engagement. So this is a really important discussion tonight, and we're looking forward to answering everybody's questions and really getting down to the nitty-gritty. Joyce Marcel is our moderator. Joyce, as you know, writes for the Commons newspaper, and she's also an award-winning newspaper to do cover stories for Vermont Business Magazine, and we're so delighted to have her. Joyce will be introducing all of our panel members, and we do ask for questions, and you can put those questions in the chat. And now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Joyce.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And we're going to be speaking today to three really interested people who know a lot about this topic. I can't say that I know a whole lot about this topic because I'm on the pro-information side of things, being a journalist. But I think today, the picture of Pope Francis in a white puffer jacket kind of exploded on the internet. And we realized that not only is there misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, there's now AI. So we are in trouble and we need help. So tonight we're going to speak to Ben Boyington, and I'm going to read, if you'll forgive me. He is an advocate for integrating critical media literacy into K-12 schools, a veteran high school teacher, and the father of two teenagers who are immersed in the worlds of video games, Discord and Twitch. I guess those are video games, as well as anime and other visual storytelling. A member of the Media Freedom Foundation board, Ben designs and conducts teacher trainings with his partners at the nonprofit organization Mass Media Literacy. In his daily life, he works with high school students on self-driven learning and builds student-centered programming at a high school in rural Vermont. Ben is also one of the authors behind The Media and Me, a guide to critical media literacy for young people. Wow. Okay, the next is Dr. Gyuri Kepes. He is an assistant professor of communications at Landmark College in Putney, Vermont, where he teaches courses in multimedia production, media, and communication theory and leadership. While at Landmark College, Dr. Kepes introduced several initiatives at Landmark, the most ambitious being the creation of a television studio and associated academic programs. In collaboration with a group of Landmark students, Dr. Kepes launched Voices TV in 2021, the college's first television network. He is a published author in the field of media and information literacy and frequently presents original research on the topic. And our last panelist, but certainly not our least, is Susanna Strothman, a solutions consultant for Deloitte, the largest professional services firm in the world. They provide audit, consulting, financial advisory, risk management, tax, and other services through their member firms. Strothman analyzed social media data for companies like Google, Nestle, and Uber at Ipsos prior to her work at Deloitte. She now focuses on identifying and sharing mis, dis, and malinformation with authorities in the state of California. Her office is at Rockefeller Center in New York City. So, Susanna, let's start out with a definition of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation.
Awesome. Thank you, Joyce. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to take a quick second to share my screen so we're all looking at the same thing. So just before we get started with all of this, I want to make sure we're using the same vocabulary when talking about these terms. Everyone's heard of misinformation before, but I think the other two terms are just as important. So to quickly break down the definitions of each, what I want to emphasize here is that the main differences between the terms are intent and factuality. Misinformation refers to false or misleading information that is shared without the intent to harm, deceive, or manipulate. This could be someone just reposting a headline without reading the content, and they don't really know what they're talking about. Disinformation is a type of misinformation, but it's the information shared with the intent to be harmful, deceptive, or manipulative. So someone like this, they know what they're saying is wrong, but they're going to share it anyway because they want to trick you. Malinformation is a little different. It's information that's technically true, but it's taken out of context. This could look like cherry-picking statistics from a study to prove your own point, but leaving out other statistics that explain the whole story and maybe tell a different story. We tend to see a lot of malinformation when it comes to things like COVID-19, the pandemic, vaccines, etc. So while these terms differ, they can influence opinion and challenge information from authoritative sources of whatever the topic is. So for the purposes of the panel today, I'll probably use like misinformation as a blanket term, and I'm sure the other panelists will as well, unless we specify that we're talking about disinformation or malinformation specifically. With that, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thank you. That was very well put. And now we're going to get a few more definitions from Gyuri. How would you define media literacy, and is it different from information literacy?
Thank you, Joyce, and thank you, Vermont Independent Media, BCTV, the Commons for hosting this wonderful workshop here. So information literacy and media literacy, I would say, are very close cousins, and there's a lot of crossover between the two. Information literacy, I would say, connects to what we call library sciences. So we have a wonderful team of librarians at Landmark College who are guiding our students through the research process of finding credible sources on the library databases. So navigating all the information that is out there. And I would say media literacy connects it that all this information that is at our fingertips exists in a vast and a media ecosystem. So being able to navigate that media ecosystem is a vital skill. All right. So traditionally, kind of the debate has been between, going back to the 90s when the internet was very new, it was between the haves and the have-nots. So people who have internet don't, or have access to information and don't. The digital divide, so to speak, as it was often called. But now the discussion has really shifted over between the know-hows and the know-nots, being able to navigate this vast system of information and knowledge. So really the knowledge gap exists really between being able to navigate this wider system, this ecosystem. So I like to think of it as an analogy about something very different, like water contamination. You need a system for testing the water, standard system for testing the contents of the water. And I see that as analogous to information literacy, being able to understand how that information operates and really get to the bottom of it. Where I see media literacy as kind of analogous is kind of the systems, the pipes. How did those waters get contaminated? If you think of Flint, Michigan, we think there's politics involved, there's economies, corporations which are leaking into the system. So thinking about the wider system in which the information, or in this case, the water, operates in. So what's leading to that contamination? And I think Flint, Michigan, it was often systemic racism. So media literacy really involved kind of system-based thinking. The political economy, how does the media operate in a wider political economy? what perspectives are being omitted or obfuscated systematically within that system. We also have to think about, there's been a lot of conversation now about government censorship, specifically around book bans, and things like that in Florida and beyond. But we have to also widen the discussion to things like corporate censorship, and how does a media system operate such that certain perspectives get omitted or silenced. Going back to the 1990s, the most famous example was 60 Minutes shelving a story about a whistleblower coming forward talking about the tobacco cancer connection. They made a film called Insider about it. So, in this case, an advertiser for CBS, Philip Morris, put pressure on 60 Minutes to shelve the story, and ultimately they only aired a very watered down version. So I really try to get my students to understand not only how to access, to evaluate, and to synthesize information, but understand where that information lives in a wider ecosystem, which I refer to as media literacy. So Nat Turner, who successfully led a slave, was the first successful slave revolt, once said communication is the bridge between clarity and confusion. Communication being this bridge, so communication can go both ways. So it's not necessarily more communication leading to clarity. So we need to build these bridges and strengthen the communication, the knowledge that we have of how the communication operates.
Okay. If you're not a student at Landmark College, how would you develop media literacy?
That's a very good question. And I think developing media literacy means, first of all, accessing that information and evaluating it systematically. I think we can be complicit in the spread of misinformation. I think having access to a variety of sources and learning about these variety of sources.
Okay, maybe Ben now can tell us, what other skills do people need to develop to achieve critical media literacy? What developmental considerations are there for teaching these skills based on age group?
Thank you, Joyce. I had some notes on definitions, and I think Gyuri pretty much covered it. So I would just add, when we talk about political economy, one of the things we're talking about is ownership, not just sort of the advertising angle and how advertisers can pressure news organizations, but actually who owns those news organizations. And I can talk about that more later, but I think that's an important idea to get up front, that ownership plays an important role. And people who are creating particularly news, since that's sort of our focus here through social media anyway, but people who create news have a purpose behind their message. And, you can see that by going to different news outlets. This is probably cliched at this point to say that, but it's right there. If you just go to Fox, you go to CNN, you go to an independent news outlet on the same story, you're going to see a different headline, creating a different immediate sort of emotional response. As far as skills go, we in The Media and Me, the book, which is for young people primarily, but I think any of us could read it and hopefully gain from it. We talk about questioning a whole lot. And for me and for us, that's what critical media literacy is all about, is the questioning. What are the questions that we have? And that's fostering a skeptical approach. And I think it's really important to talk about skepticism versus cynicism. Cynicism stops a conversation. It stops a line of thinking. It just says no. Right? Skepticism is about questioning and engagement. So skepticism opens a conversation. I think that's really important. So, when we talk about developing critical media literacy, I'm going to say that it's as much about our dispositions, about the way we look at it and the things we question, as it is about specific skills. Now, if you want to talk about skills, of course, reading, good old-fashioned text reading, information gathering, and the ability to sort of recognize credible or not credible sources. And understanding in time, at least as we get further into this kind of world of media literacy, you want to add in economics into that. And that's that political economy angle, like who owns what, why is the money flowing in the, follow the money. They used to always say this in politics. It's true in tracking the news and other media as well. And I would say for a very specific knowledge base, we should talk about bias. And we should understand bias. And we hear this all the time, right? Oh, the left-wing bias of the media, the right-wing bias of Fox News, the bias. I think that misses the point. When you limit the question of bias to ideological bias, you're missing it, right? Yes, of course, it's true, right? Fox perpetuates right-wing narratives. Fox does appear to have, they are the conservative outlets, so to speak. But there are really several other types. And the one that I would point at as the one that we see most right now is something that Brooke Gladstone wrote, a really great graphic novel style book called The Influencing Machine, but the media and the news industry, history of the news industry. And she talks about fairness bias, which I think is a really important concept to play with and look at, right? And she points out that we get a news story and you get something's happening in the world, right? And you get this idea of both sides have to be presented. We have to have fairness to hear from both sides. Well, not all sides are worth hearing from, right? Some positions are just indefensible. You're not going to have a Charlottesburg rally report and have the Nazis on. Right? That's just, why would you do that? We fought a war to prove that that was bad, and we won that war. So why would we do that? That position is indefensible. To go back to skills and developing media literacy, I think the first step is to foster curiosity. So I would say, as far as developmentally appropriate, it's not so much as what we can talk about, because you can talk about advertising, you can talk about media literacy, you can to some degree talk about ownership with second graders. It's really a question of how we talk about these things, the language that we use. So it becomes the role of the guide or the co-learner, the teacher, the parent, whoever's working with a young person. It becomes their job to engage that curiosity and to adapt language and concepts to the age, maturity, and cognition ability of the person that we're working with. That's a little harder to do independently, but when you're in a situation where you can work with a younger person or even with a friend, if you're trying to explore these issues together. So for instance, in advertising, we talk about the either or technique, whereas perhaps in a discussion of rhetoric, we would talk about the false dilemma fallacy. It's the same thing, right? But we find a way to couch those terms in a way that works for people of all ages. So I don't think there's a limit to when we start. In fact, again, I advocate for K-12 media literacy. So I think cradle to grave, really. But I think we start as soon as we can, and it should be fully integrated into every school. Other questions arise. Whose media literacy, right? Mine, but critical media literacy is what I'm going to push for. So I think, again, just to sort of quickly recap, really reading, information gathering, and understanding bias. Those are our sort of first steps, and then engage that curiosity in whatever context you're trying to learn or teach about media literacy.
Yes, thank you. Susanna, I'm going to ask you another question, but I think your Carl Sagan quote really fits in well here. So can we see that for a minute?
Which quote?
The Carl Sagan quote.
Oh.
Yes. You want to talk about that just a little?
That was mine.
Oh, it was yours?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, then I think you should talk about it.
We threw Susanna right off track there. Well, we all know Carl, right? And I think he nailed it. I mean, that's really what I was talking about with the skepticism and the cynicism. He's not saying reject everything. He's saying interrogate the people who are saying that they have the authority, who are claiming to know everything. And if we don't do that, we get what we have right now in our politics, right? There's a whole lot of, I would say, political charlatans wandering around out there and applying their trade, so to speak. So we're not asking enough questions. And a lot of the folks who are saying they're seeking truth are really seeking to uncover kind of their own agenda and are not really seeking truth. So it's an important concept.
Okay, I'm just going to read this so we all have it in our heads. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we are up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes rambling along. Let's go to Susanna now. I'm sorry about that I thought that was your quote, but can you talk about your experiences with media analysis for large firms? What did you learn about the types of posts and the information we see on social media?
Sure. So this takes a kind of more commercial look at this subject. So I started my career working at a big market research firm analyzing social media data for large companies such as Uber, Google, Whole Foods, Warner Brothers, all ones we've kind of heard of and have seen posts from or advertisements from. So these companies, among all others, use social media platforms as tools to connect with consumers. And there's a lot of behavioral science behind how those connections are identified and established. The companies do in-depth market research studies to understand the demographics of their current consumers and sometimes more importantly, their potential consumers. This research provides companies with population information on identities like race, age, gender, financial status, education level, and relevant to our topic tonight, social media platform usage. This helps the companies understand where to reach certain consumers, and that information is taken to develop marketing content that's tailored to both the platform that they're using and the individuals who will scroll past it. So an example of this would be younger generations are using TikTok far more than generations, I would say, are above 40 years old. There's still many people who are above 40 on TikTok, but the vast majority are much younger. Whereas Facebook, we've definitely seen that go in the opposite direction, where initially it started out with college students, and slowly over time it's moved to be older generations reconnecting with their college friends or their high school friends or something like that. So the companies are really working to figure out who they can target with their advertising and where they can reach them.
Well, that's a good definition. I have a question just off the top of my head. Being a very old person, I am practically an original member of Adbusters. I don't think that any corporation targeting me is benign. And I want them all to go away, especially on Facebook, which I use. So why should we, how do you defend that?
Well, defend the targeting for advertisements, is that what you're asking? I think
there is no such thing as truth in advertising, so why should we even have it?
I think that's a question of what information we're able to feel comfortable giving out to the companies, because they really only have it because we're giving it to them, not always willingly. The platforms and apps often put in opt-in options where you can say you're forced into saying, I do not want to give this information to this company, for instance, and they automatically allow you to share that information. So it's a combination of the three parties of the companies need it in order to create revenue and to continue making money off of you. Essentially, the ad platforms or the social media platforms make money from those companies, and then you're just a consumer. So I don't have a good answer as to why we should argue for it, because it just is happening mostly without our knowledge.
I find that very threatening, but I don't mean, that's my bias, and I'm upfront about that. We're getting some interesting questions now, including some skeptical ones. I'm going to throw this out to all three of you. Can we hear an example of skeptical interrogation of a person in authority who claims to be explaining the truth? Has any serious journalist ever put the iconic Dr. Fauci on the spot? Anyone? Jump right in. And we will move
As
on.
for the last part, not that I've seen, which would be great. As far as skeptical interrogation of a person in authority, et cetera, that was Mr. Sagan's quote. And when I spoke of skepticism, I was speaking of our individual skepticism, not how journalists approach that, but that's certainly a very large conversation. I think we all kind of know that investigative journalism is at least dying, if not dead, certainly in a bad straits, let's say. So I think that's a great point. Did I say all that with my mute on?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
So just the last part.
Yeah, I can't speak to anyone about the person in authority part, but I think this goes to my point was about our skepticism as individuals, and that skepticism opens a conversation. As far as journalists being deeply skeptical, I think what we're hearing from some people here, or implying at least, is what I would say too, is that investigative journalism is not, it's either no longer alive or it's not what it used to be. So we need more journalists doing that kind of questioning.
I am afraid I have a big bias here that might get us all into some trouble. I think the investigative journalism is booming right now. So, and not only the stuff that I do, but I read about 4 or 5 newspapers every day. I don't watch television news ever, but there is a great deal of investigative journalism going on, and that doesn't even take into account all the news sources online. But I don't want to argue with you. You are the expert. I am just a working journalist. So then, related to the discussion of social media analysis, how might news companies focus on profit and ownership drive their influence on news stories and how they are framed and reported?
Oh boy, that's like 8 questions in one. First of all, no disrespect intended to those who are engaged fully in their investigative journalism. I think we could clarify that with, large outlets aren't doing what they used to do. We don't have a spotlight kind of reality anymore. Anyway, we could probably find some information. I'm glad, because it certainly seemed to be dead for a while. So when we talk about ownership and profits, I think the first thing we should all think about is the basic idea of ownership. 6 companies own and create and produce and disseminate 90% of the media we consume.
Yes.
6. So there really is no choice, by the way, or very, very little. When we talk about social media, I think, in framing and profits, we're going to go right with clickbait as our first comment. You can throw that video up, that's still up if you want. This idea of clickbait. So clickbait is a headline that highlights the most salacious or prurient details of a news story to sort of grab us by the eyeballs. It gets us to click share when we're talking about social media, right? How many of us have clicked share based purely on the headline? We don't even read the article. We just go, oh, we get all upset. Read that article, click, and we send it there. You also see this kind of headline stuff like, you'll never believe. And that's sort of putting the details up front that play to the audience, right? Trans shooter kills 6 in Tennessee school. I don't know if that was an actual headline this week, but it sure could have been. It highlights that immediate thing that's going to spark somebody's sort of anger, ire, or their personal kind of thing that they are most worried about. And it happens all over the place. So the 20th century headlines, that's just a jokey clickbait thing, but I really like 17 things that will be outlawed now that women can vote, 1920 passage of suffrage, right? This one weird mold kills all germs, penicillin, right? So there's just very kind of funny things, but this is a sort of silly example of this, but it's there. So I think the other thing that we should be aware of when we think about profit and we think about social media and we think about how we consume journalism and how we share stories, critics of journalism, there are a lot of critics of journalism out there, not all of them, but there are a lot of critics of journalism who seem not to know that there are actually hierarchies that there's structures and there's a process to getting a news story published, that we don't actually, the individual journalist isn't running out and saying, I'm just going to publish this story, and they hand it to the newspaper and the newspaper publishes it, or the TV show runs it. It's not how it works, right? There are sub-editors and editors and publishers, and there's a whole kind of process to that. So that's really important, right? And when we critique journalism, it doesn't mean that we're rejecting journalism, or it shouldn't. We get a lot of people of all kinds of ideological stripes out there going, oh, all journalism is bad, or can't trust the news these days. Well, that's not really fair. And it's not really looking at like how things actually work. There are actually really good journalists out there doing really good work, and we need to respect that, and we need to protect that. But there's challenges, of course. We want to do that. So critiquing does not mean rejecting. When we think about profit, right? Years and years ago, decades back, right? It was, if it bleeds, it leads. Sex sells, right? These were sort of maxims. And under the sort of new 21st century journalism and social media, those things are ratcheted up like 100-fold. We have people who, that's how they get stories going, right? And that's what sells. And we've seen scandal, and we've seen, sex scandals, and we've seen, all this kind of stuff, right? Until the 1960s, 1970s, journalism was a loss leader. Journalism, companies who owned journalistic outlets weren't concerned about making money. And that's a very, very different landscape now, right? Journalists want to make money. And in fact, recently we had the Fox News executives being found out, or admitting, or various, right, the texts that went around, all that stuff that happened, that there were actually anchors who literally said, I don't believe this nonsense that we're saying about January 6th, but we're going to put it out there because our viewers want it. It's about viewership. It's about the money, get the money in there. The same is true about COVID narratives. Anyone who was kind of presenting, scientists who were presenting ideas that questioned the COVID narrative that we were getting, particularly vaccinations, as I understand it anyway, across corporate media, we saw those things being stifled or not allowed. So it's really everywhere. And social media sites are in many ways functioning now as news outlets. And that's not necessarily because the social media site is designing it that way. It's because the social media site is putting things out there to grab the eyeballs, right? We are the product in social media. We're not consuming their product. We are the product. We go on and they give us ads, and they give our information, or at least our sort of aggregate information to, and Susanna can talk better about this than I can. But we're the product. And so we need to keep that in mind. Like, why are we on social media? Well, we know maybe why we're there, but how are we being used? And so the news part of this and the misinformation part of this is that we are ripe for that misinformation. We're not taking the time to think and read the articles, many of us, if not most of us. I mean, I'm guilty of it, right? I've done it. I've tried to stop doing it, but I've done it. And there we are. We're reading news articles and we're pushing that forward. So when we talk about framing a story, we've got to talk about representation as well. Whose stories are told, right? And this can be about racial groups. This can be about LGBTQ folks. This can be about social economic classes. And then who's telling those stories? Because if the person who's telling the story doesn't have knowledge of that, that's going to feed the decisions that get made. We can try to be extremely fair, and I think that responsible journalists are, for sure. But if we're not getting the whole story, then it's limiting our ability to, it's limiting our knowledge, and it's restricting our ability to question and challenge what we're getting the stories. So this takes us back to ownership, right? If you haven't heard of Sinclair News Group, then you should go look it up. They bought out tons of local journalist outlets across the nation and started putting sameness, like, here, run this story. And there was a great video a couple of years ago of local journalism from across the country, same report, literally the same language, literally this, and these news readers, and I'm not going to say journalists for those folks, these news readers were literally reading the same story, and you had like 50 little boxes with the overlapping voices, and it was the exact same thing, because Sinclair, this parent company, put out like, this is the story you're going to tell and how you're going to tell it. So when we think about media literacy and taking back kind of the power, one thing, this is ironic because I'm speaking really fast right now, we need to slow down. We need to read before we share. We need to share to our friends or in our social media networks with context. Like, what are our thoughts? Why are we sharing it? What's our takeaway from that story that we're sharing? Or what specific challenge do we have, right? We should use social media as an invitation to engage, not just to infuriate each other and get likes and clicks and, spread the story because it's whatever. Talk about it, right? Make it an engagement rather than just a quick share. Thank you.
Okay, then we wanted to bring in local journalism as an antidote to that, maybe, hopefully. Since we're the Commons, we kind of like feeling that way. You want to talk about local journalism is either for-profit or nonprofit. The Commons is nonprofit. The Reformer is a for-profit. It's a daily, we're a weekly. If is it different than Fox? How would you differentiate between the Commons and Fox News? And all those cynics who are writing questions, just shut up for a minute and listen.
I don't want to get into too deeply into that kind of specific question, but I think we have to be careful with the for-profit profit distinction. I would like to think that a nonprofit company is going to be more honest, more reliable, more fair, because I know what I know about how for-profit companies work, right? And we know that it's about the eyeballs. But at the same time, we have to be careful with that, because we can't that's too easy a binary to say for-profit makes bad journalism and nonprofit makes good journalism. There are bad actors everywhere. There are errors everywhere. I think we have to be really careful. But I do think that there is a difference in that for-profit companies have or for-profit news outlets have a vested interest in making money, right? Fox News came along for whatever we talk about now, but when they first came along, Rupert Murdoch wasn't saying, we need a conservative news outlet on the stage. He saw a chink, he saw a hole, he saw a market opportunity, right? He said, it wasn't because I'm conservative, we must have a conservative. It was, there's no news that's playing to the right wing in America. Let's create that and make some money. And then, Roger Ailes comes along and creates what we have now. So I'm not for those who are anti-Fox News, I'm not excusing Rupert Murdoch here, but the origin of that company is not in the ideology, it's in the profit. And that's history, right? It's in the profit. But now Rupert Murdoch owns Fox News owns the Fox Corporation, owns the New York Post. So how likely is it going to be that the New York Post would write a story criticizing Fox News or Rupert Murdoch? The same with Jeff Bezos, right? Bezos owns the Washington Post. Is the Washington Post going to write articles criticizing Jeff Bezos or criticizing Amazon or critiquing those companies or those people? I don't think so. And we would like to think, but I think in both cases, I think for me, it's not about profit or not. It's about independent news. It's about escaping the corporate media or the legacy media. I don't like the term mainstream media, because mainstream media would mean it serves us, the mainstream. And I don't think any of those large companies do that. It's about independent media, right? That's where we should go. But remembering that it's not an easy binary. You still need to do credibility checks. You still need to, triangulate. And I think Gyuri could talk more about this, and probably better than I can, about news literacy, right? You need to look at multiple sources and look for the truth. We all know that in real life, if two people tell you a story and they were both at the same event and they tell you a story, you're going to get a slightly different or very different story from those two people. It's just human reality. So when we talk about the news, it's then influenced by all these other things. So we have to take the time, and that's the hard part, because who has the time to read multiple sources, to develop and curate sources that you trust, and hopefully that you've decided you trust for logical reasons, not for those reasons of this appeals to my ideology.
Yes. Okay, Gyuri, do you want to jump in here? I'll throw the question at you. Let's switch to the topic of purposeful disinformation and unintentional misinformation. What do you know about who does this sort of thing and why?
Well, what makes battling mis and disinformation so difficult is there's no single player, and as Ben kind of alluded to, we're probably all complicit in the spread of disinformation. Most of us probably have shared a news just based on the headline, maybe being factually dubious. So sometimes it's the news agencies themselves. Ben talked about Fox News. Spread, when the Dominion lawsuit, basically sharing stories that they didn't themselves believe in. In other cases, it's foreign actors such as the Russians interfering in the 2016 and 2020 election. Sometimes it's unscrupulous citizens, colloquially referred to as trolls in our lingo. And sometimes it's us, it's ourselves. And one common feature among all the disinformation and misinformation spread is that fake stories, according to a Stanford study recently, it travels faster and wider than real stories on Twitter. So they tested, they ran stories, and they found that the fake stories actually traveled faster and wider because it was the users that were more likely to spread these fake kind of salacious stories because of the headlines. So that there's just that factual reality there. Fake news is spreading faster and wider. I'm also just going to spread. It's a lot of the disinformation is pretty insidious and hard to spot. So I'm just going to share my screen now and just give you a few examples from the 2016-2020 election of fake Facebook accounts that are actually created. And some of us here in the audience may have joined these Facebook groups kind of unwittingly, not knowing that they were indeed fake. So I'll just share my screen here, and I'm going to bring up a few graphics. So these 6 examples are all fake accounts that were created by Russian operatives during the during the 2016 election, 2020 election, 2022 as well. So as you can see there, famously or infamously, Russians were sort of supposedly supporting Trump's campaign, but you can see that they were acting kind of on all sides of the political spectrum. There's one account supporting the BLM movement. There's an anti-Hillary. There's one supporting another supporting the BLM movement. There's one supporting a Muslim group. There's another Islamophobic group, and there's actually one kind of LGBT United, which has Bernie Sanders in a Speedo. So, what is the intent of this? Like, so why are they supporting groups across the political spectrum? And really, it's not to support one ideology; it's to sow discord and discontent and create polarization. And as we've seen, right, we almost descended into a civil war. Because these fringe perspectives, kind of the perspectives at the outliers, kind of were amplified. So it really turned up the dial of some of these fringe perspectives and kind of created this polarization that we're seeing, and as a result, seeing quite a lot of political discord on both sides. This polarization effect, this filter bubble effect that we're seeing. So another factor in this is, right, the echo chamber. And so this is a data visualization of stories that were shared across partisan divides. So as you can see, the blue obviously representing Democratic and the red representing Republican. So there's very little cross-pollination between these ideas, and the partisan stories that were connected to a particular partisan ideology were more likely to be circulated within those groups, creating this filter bubble effect. So you're much less likely to have access to information outside of your own political ideology. Another factor is kind of the emotive, nature of stories. So algorithms are designed such that stories that activate the most amount of emotional responses, the most amount of engagement, so likes, shares, comments, are pushed to the top of your results. And according to this study, which was conducted in China on social networks, the stories that elicited the most reactions, the most responses, were stories that were coded as having the emotion of anger. So red here you see is correlated with the emotion of anger. And so there's a sentiment analysis, a coding software that can scan stories and basically read the emotion of that story. So the stories that were most likely to be spread were those that elicited the emotion of anger. And second to that, it was sadness. All right, so stories that are most likely to be spread here we're seeing are those stories that elicit these very negative emotional responses. All right, so you're having that on both sides of the aisle, and you're having, again, this filter bubble effect. So the overall effect of that on a larger scale is polarization, discord. And so I think the Russian infiltration and all of that was kind of to create that. And I thought that was widely effective and visible to a large degree to most of us, that this is happening. It's not a sudden effect, it's a slow drip. And over years of this infiltration and this disinformation campaigns, this political divide kind of happens. So that's all I have to say about that. I think there's a lot more to discuss, but it's pretty deep, it's pretty insidious, and for the most part, it's invisible. And a lot of times it's us that are complicit. And as Ben said, we are the commodity kind of that's bought and sold. And the algorithms are supporting this as well, because they are profiting from these, very rich emotional responses, which are getting a lot of reactions. And I'm seeing, like in the comment section here, right, though there's some perspectives that are getting a lot of reactions. Like it's those on either side, it's those perspectives which are eliciting the anger and those most the red and the blue here.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. The that first slide you showed with the 6 different photos that are supposed to make us. What was the word you used?
Discord. Yeah.
So discord.
Divisions.
How does that work?
Well, so we have a BLM group, all right, on one side. We have also they created one that was supporting the Proud Boys. So these are factions, like on opposite ends of the political spectrum, right? So if we have groups that are amplifying those perspectives on both sides, it's going to, in fact, accentuate those differences between the groups, the political differences, ideological differences. All right. So this really is leading towards more divisions, more polarizations in our culture, in our society, less interactions, as we've seen as well, because of those filter bubbles.
Okay. I'm almost sorry I asked. I didn't mean to cut down on the questions. Throw them in there, ladies and gentlemen. I was just being sarcastic, which I think is close to being skeptical, maybe. Susanna, can you talk about your experience with COVID deniers and anti-vaxxers in California? How does the state try to stay on top of false information? And what implications does it have for other, quote, guardians of content, unquote?
Yes, so talk about a subject that I could talk about for hours. This is something I've worked on for around 2 years now. I've been working with the California State Vaccination Campaign. My team analyzes social media data to identify any misinformation that's being spread about COVID vaccines. And we take those insights and then package them up with risk response recommendations for community-based organizations and local health jurisdictions across the state to alert them to current misconceptions that could be causing vaccine hesitancy. So the state knows that misinformation is incredibly prevalent. I actually have some statistics I can pull up, but I won't belabor those because we all know it's out there. It kind of doesn't matter what side it's coming from. People let me just get this up. There we go. I won't belabor this point because the majority of people we know get their news from in the US, get their news from digital sources, mainly social media, and people, including myself, others who do this work, and honestly, everyone on the call, we're all incredibly susceptible to believing inaccurate stories that we see online. So the state tries to stay on top of misinformation by flooding social media platforms and the information space, as we call it, with accurate information. It's pretty well known in the field that content moderators, whether that's someone working for a private firm or someone at, let's say, Facebook or Twitter, shouldn't just remove or suspend an account from a platform for putting out misinformation, because 3 more accounts will pop up in its place. But several of the social media companies don't even have full content moderation teams as of recently. So the state just wants to put, or states that I've worked with, California, for example, want to put accurate information out there so it can drown out the noise of conflicting misinformation.
Wow. Okay, I don't quite understand much of that, but we're even getting questions now saying that Dr. Fauci was lying to us all that time. And this is in Brattleboro, a woke crowd, dare I say, woke crowd. How does you're providing information to California? I assume good information, or just how they should manipulate around social media?
So I think good information is an interesting point, that it really depends on who you trust and the information you trust, as Ben has, and actually Ben and Gyuri have both been talking about, because Fauci has been put on the stand as the person who is just the spokesperson for CDC, the government. Anyone who kind of disagrees with those opinions will not agree with what Fauci has said. Who knows what decisions Fauci himself made? He was just kind of like the person that we all saw as the leader of COVID-19 vaccine rollout and mandates and that kind of stuff. So he has definitely been put in a tough position there, and I can't really speak much more to that because I don't know much about it. But when it comes to putting out, I think how I would put it is the most accurate information possible. It really is about finding the trusted sources that you can reference and send to others for them to reference as well. So in terms of the state vaccination campaign, the state is a government and therefore trusts other governmental organizations more than it trusts news media. So I would never reshare something from the news for work, but we do, I'm interested to see what this comment is about ivermectin, but we do reshare studies that have been put out. And for instance, an example is a couple of weeks ago, the Florida Surgeon General put out a tweet on the fact that there were VAERS reports that increased 1,700% since COVID-19 vaccines were rolled out. And this was a concern because VAERS tracks vaccine adverse reactions, but it does not necessarily mean that an adverse reaction was caused by the vaccine. It merely detects a possibility that any governmental organization can then go investigate. So a report does not mean that anything was caused by a vaccine, and that's the important part. But the Florida Surgeon General's statement led people to believe that that was not true. So CDC and FDA put together a response and sent it to the Florida Surgeon General just to correct that misconception, because the issue was the Florida Surgeon General's post confused people. So CDC and FDA just wanted to correct that confusion. And I don't necessarily know if I would say good information, but as close to accurate as is possible based on the information is out there is what people try to put out. Because you can't get rid of people who are confused. You're never going to clear up all of the misconceptions, but you can give people sources that they can check for themselves, and can't make everyone trust everyone. So not everyone's going to love Fauci, but hopefully we can work with trusted messengers in our communities, doctors we trust, and maybe they'll be saying the same thing as Fauci. I know Vermont, it's a little, it's definitely more, as you're saying, woke, but there are certainly areas in Vermont that could use some trusted information.
I agree, but Fauci loved Vermont. He said he wished the rest of the country was like us. When he came here in the middle of the pandemic, and we had such low figures for infection, even though we sadly did have people dying. Well, I guess we could throw in a anti-vax question here. Does anyone want to answer it if we read it? I'll read it. Oh dear, here we go. Ivermectin as horse dewormer when it is used worldwide as an antiviral. Twitter was working hand in hand with the government to censor the truth. Really. The vax didn't work and children should never have been vaccinated. Well, most of what I want to say is censorable. So anyone want to answer that?
I think my short answer to that is ivermectin in large doses is just dangerous for humans. I can't speak to smaller doses. I just know that is the reason it's not recommended, is it's for horses. And it's just dangerous in large doses. So that is one I know off the top of my head. I cannot speak to vax didn't work for children, and children should never have, or vax didn't work and children should never have been vaccinated, because I just don't have those key resources to pull up. But I do know that ivermectin is dangerous. That one I can say confidently.
Okay, well, we'll take that. None of us are doctors here, but having had 4 or 5 vaccinations and never having COVID, I'm for vaccination. But I am also of the generation that didn't get polio because of vaccinations. So what do I know? Ben, you're up next. You there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Can you talk about the democratic functions of journalism and how they might inform ethics when curating information for the public? Also, how are nonprofits different from for-profit news sources? We probably circled around to that one already, but
Yeah, I think we kind of covered that one. I also want to say we have to be careful here just in this conversation. One of the things that we can talk about with social media, and it happens in conversations these days as well, is the dreaded rabbit hole. I'm here to talk about media literacy and how it can work for people of all ideological stripes. Clearly, some of you have read my ideology already and figured it out, and that's fine. But as an educator, that is not what I do, right? My goal is I meet every student where they are in whatever conversation we're having. And my role as an educator is to help them understand their world and their beliefs and be able to express themselves as clearly as possible, and perhaps provide them with the tools to go out and understand the world better. So just going to kind of make that plea to be careful with our rabbit holes. So ethics in journalism and democratic functions, it's all really interesting, and it goes back actually to the founding of our nation. The constitutional protections that were laid out for the press in the Bill of Rights, Amendment number 1, were supposed to foster well-informed and active citizens. That was the very point. And we have developed over the decades, centuries really, 5 democratic functions of journalism, the things that they're supposed to do. First, it's a marketplace of ideas, right? Sharing diverse facts, opinions, and ideas. Second, it's an agenda setter. directing the public's focus to key events and ideas. Not touching bias here yet. We're just talking about the democratic functions. There's a watchdog function, which I imagine everyone, no matter what we believe in, would approve of, that our press could be a watchdogs, exposing corruption and holding the powerful accountable. Fourth, information disseminator, acting as a tool of communication between the public and elected officials. Now, again, we have to be careful with that, right? Because we want to be sure that we're not just accepting the kind of official narrative, no matter where we are ideologically. I think we all want the truth, right? As citizens of this country. The fifth and final democratic function would be the public mobilization factor or function, in which journalism can help convince the public or help the public understand policies and issues that are so important that they require the public's involvement. Tied to that is the code of ethics, right? The Society of Professional Journalists has a code of ethics, which are the following. Number one, seek the truth and report it. Number two, minimize harm. Number three, act independently. Now, there is a hierarchy in journalism, so how independent can we be? But I think that means don't fall sway to the pressures of advertisers, of politicians, et cetera, et cetera. I mentioned Gladstone earlier. She talks about access bias, right? If you have access to a politician and you do not report what they want, or that you report something negative upon that person, you're going to lose that access. So that's a thing. The fourth ethic in the item in the code of ethics is to be accountable and transparent. And I think that, we could look at that code of ethics as news consumers, and we could start to rate the news outlets that we use. And I think we might find, I'm not sure, we might find that a lot of our local outlets are better at those four things. That might be my own, take, but I think we might find that. But these things should work together, right, to create reliable, helpful news outlets. Democratic functions can't exist without the ethics, and the ethics don't really work without the democratic, or they work to serve the democratic functions. Democratic here is lowercase d. Let's be very clear. We're not talking about Democratic Party. We're talking about our democracy, so to speak. Which brings us back to the profit point, right? When journalists are stifled by, directed by, their stories are shaped by the profit makers, then we get incomplete, dishonest, or downright unethical news. And that's real. I mean, we've seen that all over the place. Again, there are accusations across corporate media about not questioning Fauci, about not allowing questions about vaccinations to be, surfaced in actual kind of an investigative fashion, or even in a direct challenge kind of fashion. And then there's the January 6th stuff in Fox. I mean, again, I'm trying to be clear that this is operates on all kind of ideological positions. It's not like, the so-called left-wing journalists are better. It's not journalists, because journalists are individual, but outlets. It's that we have to look at what's being said and why. And that's where I come down on all of this, is look a little harder, right? Activate that skepticism, ask those questions, and be really careful with that line between skepticism and cynicism. If we're just saying it's all garbage, where are we? What's the point? What's the value of that? And if we just say, all the mainstream media is garbage, well, I don't think so. I think that we work with the news outlets we have, and we can seek better news outlets, and we can also go find some information on our own. But there is a thing called expertise. So we have to be careful with that too. And not just give up and assume that anyone telling us something is full of crap unless it's our friend telling us, right? That's really dangerous. So I'm sorry, I kind of lost the thread there. Sorry. The ethics, right? The ethics and curation of information. Short answer, TLDR, short answer. Journalism should serve the people.
Okay. Then I have a follow-up question. Tell us about solutions journalism and advocacy journalism.
So solutions journalism is an interesting kind of model that I've only seen in the last several years. And I'll read the definition I have from the Solutions Journalism Network. Solutions journalism, they say, is about covering solutions to local and global challenges so as to equip people in all communities with the knowledge to envision and build a more equitable and sustainable world. So it's a more positive spin, right? A lot of our news, as Gyuri pointed out earlier, there's that anger making or that sadness making. There's that intended to evoke an emotional reaction. And that's maybe okay a little bit, but journalism should be based on facts and information and should allow us to get the information to then do something with it. Again, to be well-informed and active citizens. Solutions journalism says, here's this thing, here's what happened, here's how people responded to it, and here's what we can do if we encounter similar situations or somehow analogous situations in our own communities, right? We want people to take action on the things that matter to them. I think that's what we want from our society, right? We want an engaged citizenry. We want people to listen to each other. I've heard a lot of people talk about division today. I think that that's the point. How do we avoid division and work on solutions and seek common ground? I was speaking with a 17-year-old student about 3 weeks ago, and she said, Boyington, I don't know, but we don't talk to each other anymore as people. Like she meant just like in political discussions and cultural discussion. We don't talk, we just stake our claim in one direction or another. I said, you're right. How do we change that? Right. And my short answer is by talking to young people and by listening to young people and fostering in them the beliefs and abilities to start working toward that kind of change. I think we're in a really interesting time period right now. And the ethics of journalism have to be based on serving the people, giving us the information we need and not lying to us and not trying to twist us and get our money through our eyeballs. Advocacy journalism takes another direction. Advocacy journalism is still fact-based, is still based in good journalism, principles of good journalism. It goes back to the muckraking idea of the early 20th century, right? We're going to expose corruption. We're going to, right? And it sort of models on that, but then says advocacy journalism is about it does present a point of view, but it does so in a fact, it's not an op-ed per se, because it uses the rules of journalism. Also a very interesting take. For me, that's a little more risky in a way than solutions journalism, and it's not as positive, right? I know a guy out in California, Ken Burrows, who does a lot of work. He calls it constructive news, but it's solutions-based journalism. It's the same kind of concept. And he talks about emphasizing stories that empower individuals by highlighting human goodness, creativity, and collaborative power. It's about the power of people to achieve goals, which is fascinating to me that those things exist.
Okay. Gyuri, you created a TV studio with students at Landmark College. How do you design and teach good ways to present information to inexperienced students? Start there.
All right, thanks, Joyce. So I created Voices TV with a group of Landmark students in 2021. And now we're at the point where we are producing a weekly newscast and actually going in to record that tomorrow in the TV studio. And what I've found is really the best way to get students to become more critical consumers of the news is actually to make them create it, get them to produce it. Of course, they need a solid basis in journalism before we do that. So we go over the code of ethics, which Ben discussed, and we talk about fact checking and all that. But it really helps them to kind of get under the hood, so to speak, and look at media systems and how they operate, from the creation, from the copywriting to the production to the editing and the distribution. So really looking under the hood and seeing like how does the media system operate on a smaller scale and kind of in a safe container at Landmark College, or college of 400 students. And so we go in there and with a script, and we're working on tight deadlines like a normal news agency would, and we come up with a lot of ethical concerns and dilemmas along the way. I think an example recently is that we misreported. This was an example of malinformation. We gave the wrong date for a COVID vaccine clinic at campus, and the students saw the implications of that. We reported incorrectly, we got the fact wrong, and they really became invested in correcting that. So it really gets at this pillar of journalism, which is accountability and transparency, which the students really pushed after that to get in the correction. And that was all of them. They took the story down, they put in a correction. So it really gets at the pillar of journalism of truth, telling the truth and doing no harm. So they really thought, oh, what are the implications? Somebody gets the time wrong, they don't get their vaccine. I know there are vaccine skeptics out there, but this could lead ostensibly to their demise or death because they don't get the vaccine. So they're really seeing the implications of truth and potentially the implications of malinformation or misinformation. So I've seen that really help them to cultivate that media literacy, which is vital for that next generation, is actually creating the news themselves, like really seeing how it operates within a wider structure. We're doing it in a safe container. Like we're doing soft news. Like we're not doing investigative stuff. We're just reporting on, the soccer game that happened and the score of that. But it really gets up to the crux of this is getting it right, and that there are implications when you get it wrong, right? When you don't get the facts right. And so I really, start from the ground up, get that foundation, those pillars, which Ben talked about in the Society of Professional Journalism, doing no harm, telling the truth, being accountable. It really comes down to those basic those pillars that we're really holding up our democracy, right? And if we take out, this what's called the fourth estate, the press, right? We're not going to be informed citizenry. And when we have this proliferation of misinformation and disinformation, we have things like January 6th, right? And so we are seeing the implications of that now, and especially dangerous now that we have AI and that bots basically going out in deep fakes. It can recreate. It can actually have a journalist, being recreated virtually or through artificial intelligence that you think could be a trusted source is actually a fake, basically a hologram, so to speak.
Could you talk just a little bit more about your news, your students? So the world that you're covering is Landmark College?
Yeah, that's kind of our little universe there. We kind of nobody really knows what's happening on campus there. The Citadel up on the hill in Putney. But we just cover all events happening on campus. We cover our Centers for Diversity and Inclusion, with events they're doing over the week. We're covering in our next package, they're shooting a college tour, which is going to be streamed by Amazon Prime. So they're going to be on campus filming next week. We got another story about self-advocacy and self-disclosure about disability. We deal with the weekly weather. So it's very soft news, but again, the facts are important. And I try to stress that to my students that we got to get it right before we go in air tomorrow. And their scripts are due tonight. And so we have an executive editor going in and looking and doing some fact checking. And sometimes we have to go in right before the shoot and like, hey, let's check this once, twice, three times, make sure it's right. Your audience is very small, but even so, it's vital that we get the story right before it goes out.
So you don't send them into Putney, you just keep them at Landmark.
We're mostly doing, very hyper local stories to Landmark. Yeah, we do an investigative unit toward the end where we kind of dig deeper into issues, but starting them off with really the soft news.
That's great for them. Do they come in with flawed impressions of what good reporting is based on their social media influences?
They definitely are lacking in the information literacy. A lot of them have very good understanding of kind of the media ecosystem. Like they know about Discord and who owns Discord and who owns Twitch and who owns Twitter, but where I'm seeing the gaps is really in the information literacy. Is being critical, not like cynical, but being critical of the information that they are reading and not sharing that information without doing the full vetting. Being able to identify if the source is credible or not. And it's a challenge now because so much of it is shrouded and visible, like these fake accounts on Facebook, that you really have to do a little bit more digging to understand that those may not be real accounts. Like at face value, you look at them and like, okay, I'm going to join that group. It's BLM. I support that cause. I'm going to join that group, but it may be a nefarious actor. So a lot of times for me, it's kind of a gut sense. Like I don't quite trust this. It's something that's a little bit intangible, and that's hard to teach, right? If you get a gut sense of like I don't trust this, it looks a little bit dubious. So that's something that has to grow through kind of experience and wisdom. And you're asking students who really live in this world and can't get the kind of analytical distance to see things for what they are sometimes.
Very interesting. Okay, Susanna, you're up next. You still there? Sure you are. So what are a few takeaways from this whole discussion? What do your public sector clients, such as the state governments, want their constituents to know?
Yeah, this has been a really interesting panel. So thank you to the other panelists for such fascinating insights. I think what Ben and Gyuri have been talking about the importance of skepticism is key. And we really need to practice reading information online with a questioning mindset, whether that's a post on Facebook or a news headline. It's essential that we determine what information is accurate before believing it's fact. So doing the research, finding what you can, especially before resharing it with others. I would say that public sector clients, the groups that I've worked with, are really interested in emphasizing the importance of trusted messengers, as we've been talking about tonight as well, when it comes to delivering any information, but especially on social media. And people are way more likely to believe something when it comes from a person with whom they share an identity, whether that's religion, race, ethnicity, or even hobbies. So I highly recommend trying to find who a community trusts and utilizing them as a trusted messenger, because we've seen even tonight that sometimes that is a challenge.
How do we help people wake up to the tricks related to social media? And you have been especially involved in this as dealing with corporations. So what should we know to look for?
That's a great question. I, even having worked in it, feel like I don't know enough there. There is a lot that is hidden from us as consumers. It's stuff we have access to. Often it's in our settings, and we can opt in or opt out of what information we're sharing. So I think a lot of it is understanding your own connection to those platforms and what access they have to your data, as well as once you find out that information, telling someone else who you may think doesn't know that. I remember recently I heard of a privacy leak at one of the companies, and I let my friends know to change their passwords, for instance, just to make sure their information was secure and they're able to continue using that platform, because I know it's something they wanted to use. So a lot of just information sharing when we have it. I don't think a lot of this is hidden online, but it's mostly about seeking it or telling others once you know something.
Okay. Is media literacy a nationwide concern? Is it being taught? Is it being studied? That question's open to anyone. Ben, you might know.
Not enough. I think, and I wrote some comments here to Lynn in her question in there about teaching media literacy. My experience and my knowledge, my travels and my research, my reading, I wouldn't say research, that's too big a word for what I've done. I know a lot of academics who do serious research in what's happening in media literacy across the nation. But my experience is that it's minimal, that we have media literacy practitioners, but we exist in pockets. We don't have a lot of unified kind of, even within the media literacy circles, there isn't necessarily agreement on how it should be taught and who's media literacy. And there are two things I'll bring up. One is that, as I wrote in the note here, that there are questions about state legislation. So there are some states who have adopted and there are some who have passed legislation. There are some states who are working on or trying to pass legislation, people within those states, to require media literacy as part of the curriculum or the state standards or whatever tools they have to force or mandate that kind of implementation. I have questions, and my colleagues in critical media literacy have questions about whose media literacy is that. For instance, Google has media literacy curricula. That's not what it works, right? It's not enough. And it's corporate biased, right? It's not going to reveal the inner workings that we were just talking about. It's not going to honor the fact that we are being used in so many ways that we are being used. That's a problem. Don't adopt Google media literacy curriculum or any corporate media literacy curriculum. There are a lot of great organizations out there doing work and helping teachers, not just ones I work with, but the Critical Media Project is really good. There's an outfit called The Lamp. There's Project Look Sharp, I think they're called. There's a whole bunch of cool organizations going on that are doing kind of direct work with teachers, providing resources. That's the kind of work that I do when I work, not just in my school, but out in the world, is really trying to work with teachers and try to figure out how to meet their students' needs in their specific contexts. What is media literacy here? And how do we honor the values and the culture of the given school? The second thing I'll bring up is that we have to be really, really careful with checklist thinking. So checklist thinking leads to checklists and the use thereof, checklist education leads to checklist thinking, right? Like, to decide on a news reliability for a given news source, it's not enough to just have a checklist and go, yes, yes, no, oh, no, we're not going to count that. You have to look more deeply, which is what we've been talking about, right? How do we look more deeply? What is bias? What is ownership? What role does that play? Is it just ideological bias? Again, I say no, that's not what we have to worry about. The third thing I'll drop is a little bit of a warning. There is an organization out there called NewsGuard. NewsGuard now has a plugin on Google Chrome, and it has been installed on lots of school computers across our nation, and it is being sold as a really great news literacy guide. Two problems with that. One is it's checklist thinking. It's red light, green light, yellow light. This site is bad, it's red light. This site is good, it's green light. And this is yellow, it's in the middle. But the bigger problem with NewsGuard is who's behind it. Follow the ownership, follow the money. NewsGuard is created by corporations, heads of people involved in like corporate power, and by former intelligence operatives from the state intelligence. Don't use NewsGuard. Advocate to get rid of it in your school's computers if you have them. It's not a good thing. I'll stop there.
Okay, I've got just one question. We have to start teaching this to younger and younger kids, don't we? Because by the time they're 10 years old, they have cell phones, they have media accounts, they have dances on TikTok, they are deep in it. How young can we start? Ben, you want to talk about that?
Are you old enough to think? I mean, really? So a story, when my older child was young, maybe 4, we were looking at I think it was in one of these kids magazines that we used to get when the kids were little, and there was a cartoon of goldfish, like the snack that smiles back. It was a cartoon, and it was a multi-strip cartoon, and it was told a little story, and it was really fun and cool for kids. My 4-year-old child, maybe he was 5, I think he was 4, looked at the edit and chuckled and liked the drawings and whatever, but then turned to me and said, "Dad, that's an advertisement, or that's an ad." And I said, "Yes, it is." Like, how did you know that? Picked up right on it. There is no too young. The book that I was involved in writing, it's called The Media and Me, A Guide to Critical Media Literacy for Young People. We wrote this book because we want young people to be able to understand these concepts, We have lots of stuff in there. One of the things that has come up today in this discussion is algorithms. I've heard that word a number of times. We have a section in the book about multiple literacies, and one of them is algorithmic literacy. So the more we can help young people understand, and again, not in a rejective, cynical way, because we're not about protectionism. We're not going to ban anything. Like, we don't believe in that, right? We believe in educating people to empower them to make the best decisions for themselves and their world. And these young people need to understand, and we all do, actually. That's why I say cradle to grave. There are a lot of us, older fogies who could learn too about these issues. But we really, you're right? Start as young as possible. And it's about how to think. It's about how to approach this stuff. It's not about what to think, because again, I don't think that it's one. And I think when we get stuck on this left wing, right wing ideological spectrum, most of us are a mix of ideological positions, right? In some ways I'm very conservative, in some ways I'm very progressive, in some ways I'm an out there lefty radical, right? My father was a lifelong Republican. He's 82 years old. He stopped being Republican and canvassed for Bernie in 2016 or 2020. Which one I can't remember. But at some point in his older age, right? So we have a mix of positions in our lives, and we need to honor that too. And that's the other part I would add, is that listen to the kids, right? We do too much TikTok bad, Instagram bad. We do too much of that rejecting. Why are they on those sites? What are they getting out of it? What's the value to them? Because there is a value. And if we don't ask and listen to the answers of our young people, we can't possibly do anything for them. We're just going to be seen as a bunch of old dummies who have nothing of value, right? And I live this with my kids, right, who are now 16 and 18. And we still talk about this stuff. And when I need to understand how Twitch works, or how, a certain, Instagram, whatever, I go to my young people, whether my own children or my students, explain this to me, right? And that's great, because you're giving them the expertise they have. You're granting them that power to advise you.
I would also just add that we can't really have a complete understanding of how these social media are operating without a fuller understanding of neuroscience and how it is connecting into our neurocircuitry. I have a 10-year-old daughter. Obviously, her prefrontal cortex is not fully developed at this point, but think of social media. We are evolved to operate in small bands of species that we had for millennia. But really, social media, opens up this whole new world. And the prefrontal cortex is all contextual thinking. So it really challenges like a 10-year-old. It's like there's these multiple contexts coming out to you, and there's like higher level thinking involved in how to navigate that. So it can be very overwhelming for these young people. And it's also highly dopaminergic. So it creates dopamine is a neuromodulator of reward-seeking behavior. So reward-seeking behavior, it's fully integrated, and algorithms are designed to augment this behavior, to keep us involved, to keep us engaged. And ultimately, we're seeing more and more depression and anxiety because we live in kind of a world that's kind of soaked in dopamine, because there's this constant kind of engagement behavior, seeking that reward as a result. So I think knowledge, like the understanding that this is an addictive technology and the algorithms are designed that way. So if we can give kids that knowledge that these tools are highly addictive, I think that can create this kind of self-reflexive response where it seems like, okay, maybe I'm not going to reach for the phone because that is my dopamine. Like that's my dopamine telling me to do that. So I think we need to teach this at the science of addiction at a younger age, because I think we can all admit we're probably addicted, and that's to some degree to our phones. So I think I'm not a neuroscientist again, but I think having just a basic understanding of how this is affecting our neurocircuitry on a fundamental level.
I think that's very important. Someone wants to tell us that the Journalism Education Association helps journalism teachers develop ethical journalism programs that emphasize media literacy. good to know. Susanna, do you want to sum up anything that you've said?
No, I think we all covered it really well. I appreciate everyone for taking the time to tune in and listen and learn from each other. It's been great learning from Gyuri and Ben as well.
I agree. And listen to our children is the takeaway. And Lynn, I think you want to say something before we end this.
Hi, guys. I think this has been a terrific conversation, much needed in this world, especially now. I think the idea of, getting young kids involved with media literacy is critical. And not only that, whatever happened to civics? I mean, and I think it was pretty clear how social media is affecting our kids and mental illness and whatever happened to going back to nature. Anyway, our next media mentoring program, which will be in April, is about influencers. Speaking of social media, who are they and what do they do? So that, I think, will be another very interesting conversation, perhaps a little eye-opening to some people in terms of, again, it's an addictive message we've got here. And so this will help people who actually want to perhaps use social media influencers to sell their idea, their product, or whatever. Anyway, so that'll be in April, mid-April. I think it's April 19th, actually. The other thing, of course, as Joy said, these programs are brought to you by the Vermont Media and and the Commons, of course. And we're happy to receive any donations. $5 or more is great. And it helps us to keep going. We also have a program in the schools where we have visiting journalists going into the schools. And we also have a couple of writing groups, and you can go to our landing page, media mentoring landing page that we actually we'll send anyone on this this program a copy of the video that'll appear on BCTV, and we'll also include the link to our landing page, which gives you the videos that have happened so far in the past year, and just more information about who we are. So thank you all very much. This has been a very interesting conversation.